Thank you, everyone. We're fortunate today to have a distinguished panel of educators who can speak to our upcoming elected school board here in Chicago, but also school board governance nationally. Sylvia Puente is president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. The Forum is a nonprofit that works for equity, justice, and economic prosperity on behalf of Latinos in Chicago and across Illinois. The Forum conducts public policy analysis and advocacy on issues including education, housing, and immigration, and has become the central voice on Latino issues. Sylvia has been recognized by Hispanic Business Magazine as one of the 100 most influential Hispanics in the United States. Paul Reville is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice of Educational Policy and Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. A former Secretary of Education for Massachusetts, Paul started his career as a Vista Youth volunteer and has served as teacher and principal of 2 urban alternative high schools. A leading researcher, policymaker, and practitioner, Paul chaired the Massachusetts State Board of Education and played a central role in the development of Massachusetts' historic Education Reform Act of 1993 and is a proponent of national educational standards. A product of Chicago Public Schools, Janice Jackson started her career as a social studies teacher and debate coach at South Shore High School, and later as its principal and then CPS Chief Education Officer. In 2017, she was appointed CEO of CPS by Mayor Rahm Emanuel and was the first CPS alumna to serve in that position. During her tenure, Bill Gates noted that the data-driven approach to student success developed under Jackson's leadership was a model for the nation. After 22 years at CPS, Janice joined the Carnegie Foundation as a senior fellow and became CEO of Hope Chicago, a new 2-generation scholarship organization with the goal of eliminating barriers to educational and economic equity by guaranteeing debt-free college and wraparound support services to Hope scholars and their parents. And moderating today is Daniel Anello, Chief Executive Officer of Kids First Chicago, which provides transparent data about Chicago public schools to aid parents in making the best educational decisions for their children. A former Unilever brand manager, Daniel brings deep quantitative analytical skills and an authentic lived experience to his role in supporting parent-led and data-informed change within CPS. He also happens to be my business school classmate from the University of Chicago. Please welcome to the Economic Club, Sylvia, Paul, Janice, and Daniel.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. Excited to be here and have this conversation. I had to bring notes because there's a lot going on as we're going to dive right in. But I was told to give a quick 3-minute background on where we are in terms of the shift from an appointed board to an elected board in Chicago. As an appointed board, we've actually been an appointed board district since the inception of Chicago Public Schools, if you go back to the 1800s, which is unusual when you have nearly 14,000 school boards in the country, and there's only about 14 that are either hybrid or appointed, and they tend to be in large urban districts like Chicago, but Chicago's always been that way. The one exception to that was a small window of time from 1980 to 1988 where there was a school finance authority. The state was overseeing our finances because we had gone into fiscal insolvency, which we can talk about the risk of that as a potential, where we are today. But for the most part, we've been an appointed board. And there's been a lot of legislation that's pushed for an elected board for many years, and it passed more recently. So now we're moving to an elected board, officially a full elected board in 2027. But it's going to be a 21-member board, and we have an interim stop in 25. We are right now in the process of electing 10 districts, 10 candidates are running, or 35 candidates are running for 10 seats. Those 10 seats will represent half the board, roughly. There's 21 total, so there'll be 10 elected and 11 appointed, including the at-large. And then in 27, that's 25, in 27 we will migrate to a fully elected school board where all 21 people will be elected. So we have this hybrid period coming, and that is the backdrop for a conversation today. But we're going to dive into the news, which I know you guys are all paying attention to because I had to rewrite these questions like 4 times. And just in feels like in the last hour. But there's a lot of stuff going on in the news. I'm going to start by leaning on my 2 Chicagoans here to do a little bit of embellishing on their very robust bios that were read to you, to share where they are now and what they're doing. But you guys are paying attention. There's a lot of pressure right now to oust Mayor Pedro, or by the mayor to oust. Freudian slip? No. To oust. CPS CEO Pedro Martinez. It appears to be tied to pressure for CPS to take out a high-interest loan. There's a lot of other stuff going on beneath the surface, which hopefully people will elaborate on. And the loan is to cover pension costs and what will be increases that come through the collective bargaining agreement. So that is the backdrop. Just a couple other facts if you're not paying attention, which I hope you all have. There's a number of orgs and people that came to Pedro's defense in this past week to say, hey, we don't think this guy should go. Instability, there's a lot of different reasons for that. Pedro himself wrote an op-ed kind of illuminating what he felt was his experience with this whole process. There are rumors right now that board members are going to step down, resign. There's pressure on board members. It's been alluded to the fact that board members that don't kind of get in line with getting rid of Pedro may be asked to leave. So there could be a vote that's taken where either board members don't vote at some point to get rid of the district CEO, or they're just not there. So 5 members are voting on a 7-member board that was 7 the day before. In many ways, and you were like, don't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Oh, geez. You already said a lot.
I said a lot. In many ways, this represents what can happen when you have an appointed board, right? It's the mayor's prerogative. These are his board members. This is what he wants to see happen in the district. So I would love to start with you, Janice. Tell folks, where are you now? What are you doing? And you've chimed in on this. What are your thoughts on kind of the current conversation that's happening right now, being a former CEO of CPS?
Okay. All right. Well, first, I don't follow directions, so I'm going to go straight to my response to your point since you want to do the debate in front of everybody. But I did say, I did share, we said in jest, we probably shouldn't talk about that as it relates to an appointed school board. But what I said to Daniel is it's more reflective of what happens when we are unclear about accountability, which we're going to talk about today. And so whether it's an elected board or a board appointed by the mayor, someone has to be accountable, right? The debate right now is about a high interest loan. We can have a conversation about what's right or wrong there, but at the end of the day, once the decision gets made under mayoral control, it goes back to one person essentially to figure it out, which is, to some people, sounds like too much power and too much responsibility. I happen to think it makes for easier decision making in a large city like this, and also with complicated finances and complicated structures. But I also worry that if we were in an elected space, when you make a decision like that, it would then be the board's responsibility to come up with an alternative and a solution. And that will be very new and different for the elected school board that is coming very, very soon. And so I'll start by telling you a little bit about what I'm doing in case I don't get another opportunity today. So as it was outlined in my bio, I'm running an organization called Hope Chicago, which is a new start. Not so new, we're actually 3 years, and I'm very proud of that. Those of you who heard our pitch early on knew it was a big dream, and we were trying to get people to bet on the dream, but 3 years later, we've made promises to over 3,000 students across Chicago, specifically on the south, southwest, and west sides of Chicago, and we have a large group of students that are in college right now, as well as over 130 parents who have enrolled in 2- or 4-year programs or post-secondary programs, which is something we're really proud of. Hope Chicago's goal is not just to provide finances for students and families to go to college debt-free. It really is to address an issue that I think a lot of folks in this room care about, which is narrowing the wealth gap between Black and Latino families and their counterparts. And, I'm biased as an educator, but I know my family has been able to disrupt cycles of generational poverty through education and entrepreneurship. So I believe deeply in creating more opportunities for students and families across this great city. And so you want to learn more about Hope Chicago, happy to talk about that, but also excited to be here today because as much as I love what I do, and get to work with a bunch of amazing students and families and a great team, you know, I can't sit on the sidelines. Anybody who knows me, I can't sit on the sidelines and watch this district fall apart. And my message to everybody in this room today is that no one in this room can afford to do that, whether you reside in 606 or right outside or have some kind of economic interest in this city. We should all be concerned about the instability of the school system. And so, first of all, I want to say plainly, I support Pedro Martinez, both because of the stability argument, but also because I think he's doing a good job providing some direction for our district to continue moving forward. Anybody that has built something, you know, your biggest fear when you transition is what's going to happen. And I'm not here to say Pedro is doing everything we started. It's not Janice Jackson's vision. I was able to lead and build on a vision that is 30, 40 years old, that started when this city decided that this is what needed to happen in order to strengthen the school system. And he has continued that vision despite all of the turmoil and the craziness that happens in this city. And I just don't think the timing right now makes sense for a transition when we have such a big transition on the horizon in the elected school board. And so it was a no-brainer to sign on and show support for that, while also acknowledging that the mayor, whoever the mayor is, it is their prerogative to make that decision. I just hope that the voices of many people are being heard, because we just don't need the instability right now. I think we need to be focused on the future and making sure that this elected school board comes in as seamlessly as possible.
Thank you. Sylvia, congratulations. I know you have some big news, so we're glad you're here with us. But yeah, if you could, you know, what are you thinking right now in the current context?
So I'm president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum, right? And our focus is on Latino equity, but we work on education issues, housing, and immigration. And we've also been very intentional in our very segregated city about leveraging and building relationships with the Black community. And we do that through a community leadership program we run that brings together Black and Latino community leaders. So people are obviously on all sides of this issue, and everyone has their own rationale and their reasoning for, I think, where they're at on it. You know, on the one hand, as someone who really believes in civic engagement and civic participation and democracy, I think it's amazing that we are undertaking this experiment to build another vehicle for people to be involved. Given what's happening at the national level, how can we not be supportive of something that promotes democracy? And on the one hand, that's what our board, this elected school board, does. And I think in a lot of ways that that's a really good thing. I think the challenge with that is, again, with our very messy democracy, it comes down to money and politics. And I think that's what we're seeing play out in terms of the politics of the current situation and who is supporting who, and really fascinating to see the emergence of all the PACs that are coming out to support the various candidates. Having said that, let me echo Janice. One of the coalitions that the Latino Policy Forum brings together is a Latino Agenda, which is a coalition of Latino leaders. And we have now issued 2 statements in support of Pedro Martinez as CEO of Chicago Public Schools. He is doing, I think, a really fine job. He is, in his own, the editorial that he wrote for the Tribune, he talked about the need for stability, which we totally endorse. And I think we also can't ignore that post-COVID, Chicago is one of the leaders among all school districts in the nation in post-COVID recovery and in reading and math recovery for our students. And what I lament, and what I want to remind us all, that what is most important in this dialogue, debate, turf war, whatever we want to call it, going on now, is what is in the best interest of our students? Mm-hmm. And how do we really make sure that our students get the best possible quality education they need to be the successful leaders for tomorrow?
Thank you. Paul, it's nice to meet you and share the stage with you. So, you have a ton of experience in this space. I'm wondering if you can just share, as an outsider looking into Chicago, what are you thinking about this change that we're about to embark on, and what do these things usually look like, and what do we look like compared to that?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. I am the outsider, so I'm going to resist the temptation to comment on current events, although I will say I have a very high regard for your superintendent.
Yeah.
But I'm struck, let me say a word about my own work. I work at Harvard, where you've heard a little bit about my background, but basically my work in teaching and mentorship has to do with bringing along young leaders to lead in public education in the 21st century, and a focus on equity. I run something called the Education Redesign Lab, which is all about place-based, collaboratively built, cradle-to-career systems that put in place a series of supports and opportunities to surround our public schools, that children spend only 20% of their waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12 in school. The rest of their time is spent outside of school, and we know that the impediments, particularly impediments associated with poverty, that get in the way of them coming to school and bringing their best selves and focused attention, get in the way of that happening. And those of us who have privilege are able to eliminate those impediments and provide supports and opportunities in the 80% of time outside of school, where children learn every bit as much as they learn in school. We just measure it in school and hold schools accountable for it. So I'm very focused on the equity mission, and Chicago's accomplished some great things in that regard. Vis-a-vis this situation now, as you move toward a new school board, and that's really what I was invited to talk about. You're about to become one of the largest, if not the largest, school boards in the nation. And the conversation we were just having is a conversation about the pendulum swinging. We're very subject in our field, as in our politics generally, for going from one extreme to another extreme. I worry about the challenges of, well, first of all, the swing. Turbulence in general is not great for the educators and the children who work in our school systems and who are responsible for students' learning and students' well-being. So that's one thing. So I think this emphasis on how do we achieve stability through these current controversies, and then with a major shift coming in the way in which we do our business and education, that's really important. But you're moving to a big board, eventually 21 members, one elected at large, as I understand it, 20 elected by individual districts. This size is a huge challenge to bring together coherence, clear, unified support as a team. Ideally, school boards operate as a team to support their chief executive in implementing the policies and strategies that the board agrees on. There are huge trade-offs in going with a school board. You are getting greater representation, but with a large number of voices around the table, it's harder to achieve efficiency and effectiveness. You have a tension also, and this is critical in this kind of situation, between people who are elected by district, by a geographic district, and don't necessarily think about the city as a whole and about what's best for the system and for all children, but they're elected by their constituents within a geographic area and feel accountable to those systems for dividing up the pie in a way that favors that particular geographic area. That isn't always in the best interest of the system as a whole, and those sort of divisions become very distracting, time-consuming, a preoccupation often of members, rather than thinking about what are the policies and strategies that are most effective for students in this district. Time is an issue. A superintendent, the average size of a school board in the United States is 5 to 7 members. So when I work with young people who are planning to be superintendents, one of the things that we tell them that's most important is having relationships with your board members so you can build relational trust, so you can build consensus, so you have time to think together out of the glare of the spotlight of meetings. And when you have 21 members and they're all elected individually, it's a problem to find the time to think strategically, to build relationships, to get to a point where you have consensus. One of the big risks of this is fragmentation, by district versus the city, and by ideology and by just a disposition toward different things, and you can't herd 21 people very easily, whether you're chairman of that board or whether you're the superintendent of schools. I think you've got some fair elections challenges. You've got the challenges of this kind of fragmentation and many sort of distractions, while at the same time we're dealing with public education system that's facing challenges. Some of them have been mentioned already. Learning loss, Chicago's done pretty well on that. But chronic absenteeism, declining enrollment, things of that nature. Cultural wars that are coming out from the sort of national politics and descending to the level of school boards, and members can get distracted with all of those. I think we have a big obligation to restore civil discourse, and I think restoring civil discourse will be a challenge in a board of this size. So there are a lot of things that I think you can do to make the best of this, or board members and the superintendent and the chairman of the board can do, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about those later. But in generally, you know, I'd approach this with a great sense of caution. This is not nirvana that you're heading toward. This is going to bring with it a whole bunch of challenges, different than the kinds of challenges you're facing today, but equally steep challenges that you as a city are going to have to grapple with, and the policymakers in education are going to have to face.
This is not nirvana that we're heading for. I love that. By the way, you took my next two questions.
I'm sorry.
They're just gone. I am curious from your vantage point, and from, I've heard you talk about this before, Sylvia, but Janice, like, is it a foregone conclusion that this, I know you're saying we're not heading for nirvana, but what are the things that you think about, the three of you, that can make a 21-member board functional?
Well, I think the first goal is moving past being just functional to productive.
Okay.
I think that, I'm being honest, and I've thought about this. The board will, you know, we will have elections, people will be installed, there will be a meeting in January, I will have popcorn, no, I'm just joking. Everybody else, I'll be watching, but seriously, it's going to happen. This is happening, and, you know, one of the things I've been telling myself is like, this is happening, stop talking about what it could be, should be. Those days are over. I'm happy to have those conversations offline, but I think for the purposes of, you know, public discourse around this, it's really making sure people understand what challenges we're going to have and that we're amplifying voices around what matters most. I think the two biggest challenges with the new board that I see, there are many, but the two challenges that we can actually do something about, first is making sure the board is representative of the students and families that we serve. In order for this to be truly democratic, as you pointed out, Sylvia, we've already made one decision that I don't think helps us achieve that, which is the way that the districts have been divided up. We've created a brand new system where the students overwhelmingly in CPS are Black and Latino. They don't have that same proportionate share of seats, which, because Chicago is hyper-segregated, we can take that as fact. I think the other issue, and I know Sylvia has talked a lot about this, is who gets to vote and who gets to participate in the process. There are folks who are left out who are a major part of the entire compilation of people in our school system. And then the second piece, which I care equally, if not more about, is who will be accountable for student outcomes. When I hear, you know, a Harvard professor come in and quote or talk about the progress that we've made, that is something that we're all incredibly proud of, and we have worked for decades to achieve that. And I worry that that focus on student outcomes, holding people accountable, and not capital A accountability and scaring folks, but really making sure that all of the financial investments, all of the time and effort that we invest in making the district strong, that it's showing up in student outcomes. And when it doesn't, who will be held accountable to that? And then the last piece, because I've sat in the seat as the superintendent, who is going to do that job? Like, it's a hard job. And it is difficult when you have the governance structure set up the way it has been in the past, where there is a degree of harmony. People are on the same page. People are like-minded. I wonder what our ability to attract a high-quality candidate who can both do the job and navigate the political landscape will look like for the city, and what that means for us in the stability that we keep trying to achieve. So I think there are things we need to be concerned about, but I think we can start to as a community, people can start to ask questions around that. And I think the media more recently has been doing a better job of both, one, informing people. Chalkbeat put out an article so you can look up the candidates, but I think that we need to be lifting up other voices so that those parents who we are all concerned about truly have a voice in this process. I'm not yet convinced that they have a voice in this new process.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, the district is 47% of the students are Latino, right? Because of the Chicago segregation, 6 of the 20 districts will have a Latino majority population. Definitely not equitable. And we know that many of the students, many of the parents of our students will not be able to vote in that upcoming election because of their immigration status. So that is a real concern in terms of how does this body represent the city overall. Now, having said that, the law does call for a non-citizen advisory committee and also a Black Student Achievement Committee, right? But it's not clear how those are going to be set up, what they're going to do, how they're going to have any influence. And since we are creating basically a new legislative body, how are these 20 members going to act, interact, form alliances? Given the money that's going to elect them, will they be predisposed to allyship or not? That's, I think, a real concern in terms of the different caucuses that form within and among the board members. Now, the flip side of that is because I think just the tremendous local journalism. I looked at the profiles of the 31 people who are on the ballot. They are educators, they are parents, they are committed community leaders with heart and passion and commitment to take on this brand new experiment and not get paid for it, right? So that's given me a little bit of hope, and that I think that most of them really, they care and they want the best for their children, they want the best for our schools, they want the best for our communities. And, you know, it is an experiment because we don't know how it's going to play out. And the other thing that I was noticing when I was looking at this is not only is there not alignment racially, ethnically in terms of how the districts are, have been developed, it's also not equitable in terms of schools. There are some districts that have 90 to 100 schools and others that have 40. So another level of accountability of who are these folks going to be responsible to. Because obviously they have to have an investment in the schools and the parents of those schools, but how is that going to play out when there's just such breadth of even the number of schools in each of the districts?
Paul, thoughts on?
So let me take it from the sort of top level of school boards and what school boards are responsible for. The focus here is on change, and you're going to change the way in which you get a board. But in the end, you're still going to have a board, just as you have a board now. It's just the members get there in a different way. So it's really important to remind ourselves what the board is responsible. The board is responsible for hiring and supporting a chief executive officer, for paying attention to student performance, for monitoring how the strategies that the district is implementing are actually working, to review the data, and to make decisions on strategy based on that data, for approving a budget and bringing fiscal stability and fiduciary responsibility to the way in which the district organizes its financial health and well-being, to set goals for the school system overall and measure progress against those goals and hold folks accountable for their share, as Janice was saying, of that achievement or lack of achievement that goes on there. So when you come back to thinking about the board, it's really important to make sure that however they get there and whatever their background and whatever their geography, that responsibility is the same for all of them. So how do you make sure that they get that job done? I think this will be a group of people that's never worked together. You can't always make the assumption, even if they're well-intentioned or deeply experienced in the field, that board members understand the responsibilities of what it means to be a board member, For example, you have no individual authority as an individual board member to tell anybody in the school system what to do. This actually gets lost oftentimes with district representation because folks in districts have the assumption, well, the people in the district elected me, therefore these are my schools. So never mind the superintendent, I'm going to tell you what you need to do in this school, or I'm going to control who's principal of this school. And you have those kinds of tensions. So being clear in orienting board members to what their responsibilities are and what their power and authority is as a board. You only have an authority as a board member when you're in a majority. And that's a different thing than having individual authority. What are our norms as a board in terms of how we interact with one another and how we interact with the community? How are we going to set goals? How are we going to set clear expectations? I've done a lot of school board trainings in my career. You know, you sometimes get a board and you get board members, one of whom will say to the superintendent, you know, I want, and on this issue that we're about to consider, every document that you've ever received on this topic, and if you don't give it to me, I'll assume there's some kind of conspiracy behind the scenes. And you have another board member who's going to say, I don't want anything more than a page. I'm busy, I've got another job to do, and just give me one page. And you've got the superintendent, somebody in Janice's position, trying to sort out, okay, what are we going to have as a group, as our norms here? So setting those norms, setting expectations, making the time for a board to come together as a team. You know, we have sports teams, they get together every day over months and months, maybe years and years to form a team. And a board member has got to be a team if it's going to make a difference in the lives of children. And that means, you know, orientation, it means retreats where you go away together and think collectively about strategy and performance. It means having dedicated meetings so board members get informed on topics that they're called upon to make decisions, but about which they may not know anything in great depth. And so they learn about those topics, focus on building relational trust and how people get to know one another, interact with one another, and interact with the superintendent, on communicating clearly, on having board members have responsibility for being the outward-facing side of the school department to connect with the constituents in their neighborhood and represent those views back to the system. And so there are ways in which large boards like this sometimes have board members convening on behalf of the district meetings and events in the community to begin to bring forward that. So I think clarification of roles and responsibilities, clear communications, no surprises. There are a whole bunch of norms that boards need to develop, and I think you need to make time to do that.
And to Janice's point, it's not clear who is accountable or responsible
For doing
any of that, right, as we create this. So we have this overarching legislation, which sets this broad structure, but it doesn't lay out any of the detail, and it's not clear even within the board or in the mayor's office who's responsible for even where is the board going to sit, because there aren't enough seats, and who's going to staff them, and how do they relate to families, much less any of the things that you've raised, Paul.
Yeah.
And so let's stay there for a second, because I might as well throw this away at this point. But I am curious, like, who do you guys think is responsible for ensuring that the expertise is there, the training? Because to your point earlier, Sylvia, about the number of groups that are emerging that are all about getting their person into the seat or the seats, there's like 10 of those, brand new. And shout out to Bridget Lee and all who's in the room somewhere. Like, there's one organization that has emerged whose job they've taken on is to train board members how to be board members. So if the district's not doing that, is it the district's responsibility? Is it the mayor? Is it the people who pass the legislation? Like, where does that live?
What you find in situations like this is, I mean, typically there are two people here. One is the superintendent. So the superintendent has to take a proactive role in orienting board members and helping them to understand their responsibilities and understand what sorts of strategies the system is already engaged in and what are the key policy choices that need to be made and making them feel part of the team. The other is the chair of the board. And now, I don't know, because I haven't examined the legislation, whether it specifies which prerogatives it specifies for the chair. Typically, the chair sets the agenda, the chair appoints committees. I mean, one of the things this board is going to have to think about is what kind of a committee structure you're going to have with 21 people, if any, because it's not efficient to have every issue discussed at length with 21 people. You're going to have a group coming forward and making recommendations, but there'll be competition and concerns about who's on which committee and how you deal with the recommendations of committees coming forward. So the chair of the board and the superintendent, I think, will play a key role in shaping what goes forward in terms of how the board operates.
I would add, because I was going to say it first, and I'm glad you said something nice. But honest, to me, I think the mayor is morally and, in our case, legitimately responsible for this transition. And let's start with the fact that CTU, and people supported it. It wasn't just CTU. They championed a very popular idea. Polling around elected school boards is through the roof. So it's not like it was an agenda in the back room that nobody agreed with, and we're here. People agree with this structure. However, we're here through a lot of advocacy. And so if this is truly what was desired, there should be a level of responsibility around creating a system that is equitable, number one, which is a value we all share, and that works and functions. You don't get to put out a big idea and then step back and not create the infrastructure for that work. I do think, so that's from a moral standpoint, but even from a legitimate standpoint, we still do have a hybrid. So as we make this transition, there's one person who can say, we're having these meetings. We do have to do training. Hopefully it is through Bridget's program. But we have to get people on the same page. And I will add that I do think CPS has even more responsibility than what has been displayed thus far. I think the fact that parents are unaware of what's happening is a shame, despite some of the improvements around media in this issue. I think the last study we talked about, 63% of people don't even know that this is happening. And the number is even lower for Black and Latino people. I think it's like 34%. So again, this is something, if you think about systemic structures and inherent racism and all these things we want to disrupt, we are in fact creating a brand new system with all of those features and hallmarks. And we have the ability to do something about it. Nothing is stopping us from informing students and families about what's going on every single day. Nothing is stopping us from making it plain who's running, what their positions are, so that families can actively participate in this. And so I think that while we're debating like some of the issues you talked about at the top of this, we're missing the biggest point, which is if we are moving to something more democratic, why aren't we getting the people who this was created for more involved in this process? It could be beautiful. We're not there yet because the infrastructure isn't there, and we're not spending enough time making sure that the people who I think deserve it the most are aware and participating in this process.
I just underline that point made about the mayor. We work with a number of cities around the country, and oftentimes mayors have no responsibility with respect to education. It's a separate bureaucracy, separate governance system, but they always have influence because they have influence over the city council, they have influence over the city's budget, and it's very difficult for a school system to operate if the mayor in any way expresses a lack of confidence in the school system or the leadership of the school system, be it the board or the superintendent. So the mayor can have an extraordinary influence in helping to move the board to do the right thing on various issues, either behind the scenes and influencing members or leadership of the board or leadership of the district, or in public proclamations of one kind or another to urge the board to move in particular directions. So I think that's a really important point that Janice made.
And just to highlight, Bridget, who's in the room, we have to really give credit to philanthropy, who is invested in this program at National Louis University that is training potential board members. Now, there is no seal that every board member who runs has to go through this training, right? But that training is available to lay out the broad set of responsibilities, to identify the major issues that they're going to have to deal with, so that at least some of the people running have gone through this training. I personally think it should be required. Yeah. I really appreciate that it is an entity outside of this political process that's doing the training, a university, and that is doing it without any imprimatur of the politics, right? I think that that's essential for anyone who's running for the school board because it is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But I think that the challenge will remain as it comes down to really deciding on the budget and how are we going to address the deficit that's facing CPS, and how are we going to really think about the CEO contract. All those other really critical decisions, to me, are just unknowns. I think, to Janice's point, the mayor or the mayor's office could do some agenda setting around that, but I don't think that they're going to be able to do it all because fundamentally we are in this fractured system where there's a lot of mistrust. And the large majority of the board members come January will be the mayor's appointees, 11 of the 21, but not all of them will. And so how does the system and the individuals who are elected align themselves to even understand the scope of what they've got to do, much less figure out what are the policy opportunities and the best policies we can put forward for our students.
Thank you, Sylvia. So get your questions ready because I'm coming to you guys next. But one thing that's connected to this is just, so our organization, Kids for Chicago, does parent advocacy work. We try to get parents into these conversations and really help them understand what's going on in the broader landscape so that they can weigh in with direct lived experience on what they think is best for them. And they were a big part of the push, both to get to an elected school board was something that a lot of parents wanted, to your point, but it didn't look like the one that we have now. And so before we pivot to the audience, you know, I was telling Janice about a meeting I had with our parent advisory board where they were demoralized. You know, the parents we represent are 100% Black and Latinx. 90% of them probably make below the median income level. And they were like, this board isn't for us. And when they started, they thought it was. They saw the promise. The signature requirements, like all of the politics of like who gets to stay on the ballot and signatures get challenged, like those thresholds are super high. You have to be kind of a masochist to go do this job without getting compensated for it. That's not there. Non-citizen participation. Like when you think about, and this is something that maybe not everybody's aware of, but like the state is deciding the board for Chicago, and even the districting is something that the state has decided. Districting, about half of the school boards in school districts across Illinois, half of them have districts and the other half are just at large, right, in terms of how they do their elections. But the districts are usually decided by the municipality and approved by ISB. It's not, hey, here's what your districts are going to look like, which I think is where some of that friction comes in and how many schools. So there's a lot that the state is kind of, I guess, prescribed, and there was involvement, obviously, from the city. When you think about changes that we might be able to pursue to make this work where it is representative and does do the beautiful thing that we want it to do, like what are some of those things? I'll start with you. But.
Yeah, I think the first one, and this was brought up earlier, is that people should be compensated. And I know at first blush, people are like, whoa, why? But if you are not going to compensate people, most of the families that I'm concerned about cannot participate. They're working 50, 60 hours a week below and making below the median income, and they don't have time to do the work that's required. The average board member, an active board member, is going to spend anywhere between 5 to 20 hours a week on board business, whether that is physically sitting in meetings or committee meetings, or hopefully reading the dense material that is oftentimes difficult because it's the first time people have even looked at these kind of documents. So you have to spend a lot of time doing that. So to ask, you know, I've been quoted saying this, but to have the mom from Inglewood participate who works a regular job, I would love to see that. Those people were in that session, in that training course that Bridget did. The reality is they would have to quit their jobs in order to do this, and that is just something that is not possible for most people. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the board is too big. That probably is not going to change, but I think 21 is crazy, and at some point that is going to be challenged and maybe have to change. I don't know. We hope, but I think those are the the two that come to mind, top of mind for me. And then I do think that there are things that we haven't talked a lot about that may come down the pipeline later, which is just campaign finance. Like, we haven't even looked under the hood really on who support whom, and there are interests on both sides, and there may be emerging interests that we don't even know about. But right now it's kind of a free-for-all. You can almost do anything, and I think that's a dangerous way to set up a new system.
Thank you.
I think the point was made about, you made, Dan, about family engagement. And I think even if that seems absent or families are disappointed in the way that it's setting up right now, it doesn't mean that the system as a whole has to abandon that as a strategy. And I think as we think about bringing kids back to school post-COVID, as we think about absenteeism problems or declining enrollment problems or parents and kids voting with their feet to leave school systems, this business about engaging families is a critically important strategy to advance learning. Because in the end, after all these conversations we're talking about who gets on the board and how do they operate and so on and so forth, in the end, this is an endeavor that's about student learning.
Yeah.
And that we've got to keep the focus. The community's got to, this is sort of community accountability, sort of popular accountability is to say, what are you doing to advance student learning? I think the point about compensation, most school boards have some level of compensation for board members because of the time commitment involved. In some instances, it's outsized. In Los Angeles, it's $125,000 a year for a school board member. And so I think that this trade-off that individuals have to make, but do I have a job or do I serve on the board? You should think carefully about it. At the same time, I'm wary of board members becoming full-time jobs because I think that becomes a nuisance for the superintendent.
Yes.
And the same thing applies to staffing. I'd be careful about how much you're going to invest in staffing board members. A lot of mischief gets done by school board staff members looking for ways to tell the district what to do, and you've already hired a chief executive and an entire staff of a school system to execute on policies that the board has approved. So there are cautions with all of these things, but I think that thinking some about compensation, thinking about family engagement and how you're going to make that part of the way the board operates and part of the way the school system operates to move into the future, I think is a good idea.
Yeah.
So 2 things I would add or underscore. One, given what I said earlier, what kind of training will those elected to who are both running and elected have, right? And right now, there is a program out there, but not all the potential members have gone through that training. So that training, other trainings like it, so that people have a sense of what their basic roles and responsibilities and the complexity that they're walking into, I think is just so critical and so important. And then I think the other thing that's really important around that, well, I'm losing my train of thought. In addition to this, the training, I think it's really important. Well, I lost my train of thought. So.
Happens to me all the time.
I'm going to pivot to you guys now. Burning questions, thoughts, things that you want to.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It's so good to see you all. I'm Dominique Jordan-Turner. I come with this question as a former CPS board member appointed under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, but more importantly as a mom of a Chicago Public School student. I hadn't heard, as we talked about roles and responsibilities, any mention of the local school council. And as a board member and a mom, I was struck at the level of responsibility and impact that local school council has in selecting a principal and ultimately creating culture and outcomes for those schools. It was a surprise to many, and oftentimes the parents who had questions, we sent them back to their local school council and the local schools. And so I would love it if somebody could speak to roles and responsibilities in this already complex system of where the local school council fits in there versus the roles and responsibilities of this new board.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the story around Chicago's reform effort starts with the local school council. That was a big part of the governance change that happened back in '89. And essentially, they will retain the same power to select the principal, approve the budget, approve the school improvement plan, and act as the local voice and leader of those schools. But I do think it's a good question and something that I've wondered about is like, what is their role now in this new system? I was also shocked that many of them didn't run for the elected school board. I don't know why. Maybe other people in this room have studied the issue and are closer to it, but I would have loved to see more people who had experience on the local school council going into these roles. And that may be the case for some of the educators on there, but I would have loved to see more of the parents take on that role, those roles and responsibilities. I think it's still a big question when we think about how to make the board as productive as possible. I think how they engage with local school councils and how they respect their power is going to be something that people are going to pay attention to. And I think local school council leaders are going to demand that they keep that same level of authority.
The point that I wanted to make earlier is I think we also need to think about, as we think about what role will local school councils and others have in this, is what responsibility do we all have, right?
Yeah.
Will we have various accountability systems that come from the economic club, from the civic committee? Will parent-engaged accountability structures emerge, right? So that, because to the bottom line of how do we have accountability and who is responsible for what, right? And I think we also need to simplify some things. You know, we need to figure out a way that parents can understand this multi-billion-dollar budget and what it is that they have to approve and work on. So I think that this is also the opportunity for all of us to collectively decide what kind of an ecosystem of accountability will we build on so that we can be in productive dialogue with our schools for the benefit of our children.
Good afternoon, Raul Raimundo, with the Resurrection Project, also a graduate of Benito Juarez High School, where our current superintendent also graduated from. There's a couple of elephants in the room that we yet to address. One is when the full school board takes over, there's going to be conversations possibly of consolidation of schools. Also, I think all of us agree in principle that more resources are needed for the schools, but they need to be applied correctly. I mean, I know the business community, the community sector, the public sector, the philanthropic sector, nobody wants to see strikes, and everybody wants to see our children learning, as Janice mentioned, for long-term benefit of wealth-building strategies. I just don't see a concerted effort or a synchronized effort to start planning ahead, because right now I feel like we're reacting to something that came. And the state is the one that kind of imposed a lot of this. Now we're looking at city to implement this, right? So the state has a lot of responsibility, officials that created this enabling legislation, that we need to figure out how to get ahead and not react to some real issues beyond what we're dealing with, this experiment that are coming. And we have yet to really address that.
I don't know if there's a question or just on it. I think I agree. Is there a question specifically? Because
your reaction to, I think, the two elephants in the room about the resources. I mean, we're talking about a $9 billion budget that is a tremendous economic engine, if you will, to the city, that folks are going to decide on perhaps even more. It's just not reacting, but getting ahead of what's coming.
Yeah, I think you pointed out a couple of things, and dealing with school enrollment issues and whatever actions are going to be taken as a result of that are one of many big issues that the new school board and whoever is the CEO and superintendent, whether it's Pedro or a new person, will have to deal with in the next couple of years. Also, creating or codifying a contract with the union and being able to pay for it. And one of the things that I worry about is like people getting up to speed on that. And I think that is something that can be solved by the conversations that some of the strategies that have been lifted up in this room today, a lot of awareness building, training. What I don't think you can train people on, and I think, I'm just gonna say it, I think we're seeing this now with this issue around the loan and the CEO's contract, is you can't train people on making consequential decisions for other people's lives. That is something that is new and that is difficult. And every new member on that board, all 21 of the people that are going to be on that board, will be probably have the most pressure that they're ever going to have in their lives going into that role while we are trying to solve for these big issues. And so I don't think I have a response other than acknowledging that that's what's coming down the pipeline. As far as the state, I think they would argue this, they were responding to what the constituents in Chicago said they wanted. And, you know, I don't know. I don't work for the state, as you guys know, but I think it's our responsibility to deal with it. People asked for it and they responded to it. I think that's what they would say, and I think it's a sufficient answer. What I will say that hasn't been talked about is who is going to advocate for the funding from Springfield, because that is a huge issue and our district is still underfunded. And right now, despite some of the conversations, the mayor plays a huge role in doing that. And so if the mayor is no longer fully responsible for the district, or that'll be the case in a few years, who is the primary person? Is it a coalition of 21 people trying to go and influence the General Assembly and the governor? I don't know. It gets to be way more complicated and the stakes are high and they're going to be even higher. So it's just an observation, but I don't have a good answer right now, but something for us to be paying attention to.
And if this contract is concluded before those members are elected in November and appointed in January, they've got to deal with not only whatever fiscal decisions this board makes, but the long-term fiscal decisions that also haven't been the best decisions in the past, because this is not the first time that it's been suggested that the Chicago Public Schools take out high-interest loans, right? There's a significant body of those loans that are out there. The challenge is that the accumulation of them is making any decisions so much more consequential at this point in time. It was easier when it was the first 100 million, the second 100 million, right? But now that we've had such an accumulation of those loans, it really, the fiscal consequences, I think, are just so much more eminent, right? But I also just want to say, I mean, despite all the challenges and we know the tensions and everything that's brewing, I don't think anyone here would disagree what is fundamentally being asked for, and that every school should have a library with books in it. Every school should have a nurse. Every school should have teachers that are qualified, and enough of them to be able to teach our children in whatever language they deserve to be taught in, right? And so for me, this whole question, you know, I always come down to values. And what's so distressing to me personally is that I believe the fundamental values of this tense moment that they're in are the same. We all want these things for our children. All children deserve this in our schools, right? But it is then, how do you do that and have the fiscal stewardship and the fiscal stability and the financial responsibility that is the reality of the moment that we're in?
I think part of the leadership responsibility and prerogative here is to somehow welcome the public into solving the problems that leaders and policymakers are called upon to solve. So if you have deep and painful experience with school closings here, the business about welcoming the public into that, as hard as those decisions are, and getting the input, even if it doesn't turn out the way every citizen wanted it to turn out, people feel they're involved. Same thing with balancing the budget. When I used to be Secretary of Education, we'd have budget hearings when there was a recession and go around and say to people, look, we don't have the luxury of printing money. We've got to hit a balanced budget. You tell me how you want to balance this budget. We'd have every advocate coming up and telling us, spend more on what I believe in. And we'd say, well, okay, that's fine. What would you like us to cut? So welcome them into the problem of getting teachers, high quality teachers that Sylvia just mentioned. We have now, 15 years ago, maybe 12% of undergraduates in the US were listing education as their major. Now it's gone down to about 4%. This is a problem that Chicago and other places are going to face. So we have the goal, we have the value of wanting a high-quality teacher in front of every student, but policymakers and school leaders have problems to solve. And to the degree that we make the public aware of that, welcome them into the solution of those problems, then we'll be able to preserve some kind of stability going forward in the district.
The only thing I would add, I agree with both, but it requires leadership, because in a perfect world, the values would drive everything and the money would materialize. It's not like that. And although CPS has been in a position, you know, a tough financial position before, what is distinctly different now is the just refusal to look at efficiencies, and those things do impact quality of instruction. And I've said I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm not even going to look at my team because they're like, why are you talking about this? But at the end of the day, when we don't take proactive steps to make sure our schools are set up and so that kids truly have teachers in front of them, that the principals can attract folks long-term to stay in schools because they see them as viable places of learning, it's irresponsible. And you can't use values to replace kids at Hirsch taking gym online, kids across the district not having the same opportunities. And so that is why leadership matters a lot, and who is going to be held accountable matters a lot, because when you got 21 people, it's going to be a lot of this. And our kids don't deserve this. They deserve somebody to raise their hand and stand up and say, we're going to do this right, and that has not been happening.
That's amazing. I agree. Which brings me, I think, to my question. I'm Gabrielle Lyon with Illinois Humanities. Go Broncos. Kenwood in the house? Okay, no. Okay, yeah, I see you. Okay, here's my question. With those kinds of issues, I think it brings me back to the opening concern, which is that this is a kind of misrepresentative configuration. It's certainly not a representative configuration. And so I guess to the moderator's closing question from before, you know, what is the design possibility if we were going to change so that we have representatives who are thinking about the system as a whole, while still making sure that it's representative of the students and parents in the system and the stakeholders, all of whom are us right here. But the design is problematic, and those issues, when they come up, can't just be, I want District 1 to have all the stuff, even though I have the fewest number of schools.
Well, not everyone believes the design is problematic, right? So I think that we have to start with that, right? There are some people that really believe this is a good model. And I personally think it's untested, right? I mean, I keep using the word experiment. And I think to the comment that you made, every political issue, every dynamic, it's a pendulum. And now the pendulum has swung this way. An elected school board, we're creating another process for civic engagement and democracy. We're creating another process to figure out how do we have representation, whether it's equitable representation or misrepresentation, it still is elected representation. Right? And personally, I just think that process is going to have to play out before we can figure out is there a need or if there will be a redesign.
If I were ideally designing to respond to your question, I'd go smaller and I'd go hybrid. I'd go, you know, some combination of appointed that are the appointed people have at-large responsibilities for the whole city, and then some district representation that brings in the voices of people within districts. And then a robust advisory mechanism, and I understand there's some of that in the current legislation, but of various groups on the outside that are charged with providing advice to the board, and the board has to regularly consult them.
Any other thoughts?
And I'll just say that Chicago is the birthplace of community organizing. We all know that, right? So again, the invitation is for all of us, in addition to the systems that will be created within the CPS board structure or out of the mayor's office, then what is that outside civic actor coalition building that needs to happen across the city, right? Because when we really look across the city, I mean, my organization is downtown. We are not a neighborhood organization. As challenging as this moment is, I am totally encouraged and in awe of all of the community and neighborhood leaders who run for elected school councils, the parents who volunteer in their schools, and the people that have stepped up to run for this board, right? How do we organize, how do we have this broader civic city dialogue in this moment about how we figure out what accountability and responsibility is, and then how do we advocate that, especially given the DNA in our city around community organizing.
Thank you. John Edwardson. I'm the co-chair of Advance Illinois, and I've spent much of the last 15 years thinking about public education in the state of Illinois. And I have a question for the Harvard professor. holding people accountable and trying to figure out what is the best organizational structure to produce the best results. So I go back to my time in the airline industry, and if we were operating 1/3 of our flights on schedule, I probably wouldn't have had my job for very many years. We're educating people to read at grade level and do math at grade level, and we think we're in pretty good shape if we're in the high 30s. I don't think there's a business person in America that would think we're doing a very good job. So as you look across the nation and the research you've done, what is the best organizational structure that produces the highest results that show student achievement?
Well, to answer that question, I have to go bigger to sort of the macro environment. See, I as my opening remarks indicated to some degree, schools alone are insufficient to do the job of equity in this country. So that's a baseline premise that I approach. Schools can make a vital contribution. Schools make all the difference of opportunity in some people's lives. But on the whole, we still live in a nation where there's an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. And so if we're going to interrupt that, we have to go for a wider set of solutions than just schools. So I don't attribute those third grade reading results that you cited exclusively to schools. Schools obviously have a big role to play in teaching of reading, but if kids aren't in schools, if they aren't attending schools because their lives are disrupted, they don't have stable housing, they don't have adequate nutrition, they don't have decent health care, there's no family formation that allows family to have jobs and things of that nature, then we can't hold the schools accountable if they're not there, if they're chronically absent and things of that nature. So organizationally, obviously, we have to have a school system that has bureaucratic accountability, and we have to have sort of, what Sylvia was pointing to is kind of a civic accountability where communities hold the school system accountable. So if you go into the suburbs, for example, if the college admissions rate ticks down once or twice, the community's up in arms and come into the school board and saying, you got to change something, you got to do something different. That is a community-wide accountability. You get in a more complex urban environment, and there are many people just struggling for survival in that kind of environment, and you have many different views of how we get to where we're going to go. So there's less of that kind of accountability, but the board has to bring the accountability. So there is this kind of bureaucratic top-down organizational accountability that a school board is responsible for holding, a superintendent responsible for holding, the people out in schools responsible bureaucratically. But it's the culture surrounding the schools, the community organizations, the civic leadership represented in this kind of room, and the way in which we define the problem. So I guess my main response to that question is we have to look larger at the conditions of life outside of school where students spend 80% of their waking hours and that get in the way of them coming to school ready to learn. To the degree that we mitigate that, then we eliminate some of the challenges, some of the biggest challenges that get in the way of school performance.
Yeah. So, wow, that was well timed. I want to say thank you to our panelists. This has been awesome to just kind of sit here and listen to you. I do want to remind folks from a community standpoint, I think everybody here has said, in different ways that everybody in this room has a role to play in what happens in Chicago Public Schools. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that we've been through 30 years of continuous growth and improvement in the system, with you leading a big chunk of that, despite turmoil and tumult. So we have things to figure out. It's an experiment, but it is not a foregone conclusion that kids in this city can't learn, because we've seen them do that through difficult challenges before.
Forgot to say one thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Close
I'm
out.
not trying to get the last word either. One thing I did not say today that's important in this room is that everyone in this room has a responsibility as well. We didn't talk a lot about that. I think the last time I checked, this number may be outdated, but I think all told, the candidates have raised about $800,000. I don't even think it went past $1 million. If people took time out of their day to come here today and learn about this, if you heard anything that motivates you, I would encourage you to think about the candidates, because these are people who have signed up to do something incredibly difficult. They don't come in rooms like this and get to pitch and ask people to support them, but that also doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to seek them out and to support. The fact that people will be making decisions about a $9.9 billion budget, and right now it's $1 million race in a city like this is crazy. So there are people who need more support. I won't say who they are, but you should look for them, and you should feel, I hope this conversation compels you to go out and support people who are stepping up to help lead our district.
Thank you. So as a corporate leader and a CPS parent, I have found this conversation to be incredibly insightful, and so I certainly want to thank, on behalf of our audience, Sylvia, Paul, Janice, and Dan for your, Daniel, for your expertise and your perspectives. Let's give them a round of applause, please.